Hello, and welcome to the Pro Series Conversations from CheckBox Pro. My name is Missy, and I'm the founder of CheckBox Pro, where we help school leaders become their most efficient and effective selves by matching them with ed-focused executive assistants. Each member of our team has over 10 years of experience in the education sphere, and though we may consider ourselves pros in some areas, we can't be an expert in every area. This is why we are excited to bring folks working in the education space to offer tools, tips, and insights to make the life of a school leader even more sustainable. Today, my guest is James Aycock. A creative and analytical educator, James has distinguished himself as an innovator in special education, response to instruction and intervention, or RTI, and data-driven leadership. James currently wears several hats at Libertas School of Memphis, which has transformed the former Brookmead School from the 10th of a percentile in the state for academic achievement to the 25th percentile, 50th percentile for African American students, 85th percentile for students with disabilities, and rising. Libertas was recently named a reward school for student growth among the top 5% in the state. In addition to co-teaching ELA and math, James coordinates student support for the new Libertas Middle School. In his spare time, James enjoys spending time with his wife, Holly, and their 2 teenage kids. He also serves as the board chair for the First Baptist Day School, advancement coordinator for Scout Troop 34, and Bible study teacher at church. Without further ado, Mr. James Aycock.
Thank you.
Hello. Do you just love hearing a bio about yourself? It's really fun reading them. I love reading them. It's obviously fun for me. But I think if I was on the recipient end, I'd be like, oh, can I just this? Like, yeah. Let's get through that part. So, but it's good. People need to hear all their accomplishments in one little 30-second segment. Well, James, thanks so much again, for being here with me today. Like I said, I gave folks a broad overview of who you are. You've gotten a shout out in a previous Pro Series conversation with Sam Durant because, you and I tag team some scheduling. You and I tag team some, dismissal duty. You and I have tag teamed quite a few things over at our time at Grizzlies Prep. So I know you very well. But I would just love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners, provide maybe a little bit more context about how and why you got into this work.
Yeah. I went to, my undergrad is in religion. I went to grad school at School of Theology at Emory and was on an academic program and did my master's there. It's kind of like a program that can set you up for PhD work. And I was studying ethics is what I was studying, and really got into when we were studying biomedical ethics, got into disability studies, and that really resonated with me. And as I was doing research and writing papers, I started to pull back from some of my experience growing up, and it really came back to the church that I grew up in that had a couple of kids who had disabilities, and that ended up being my summer job for 3 summers, I think. Was working with one student who's one kid who is a friend of our family's. I grew up really close to them, going to their house all the time, and it kind of was natural. Like, hey, would you like to keep our son over the summer? And that would be a lot of fun. So we did a lot of different activities. We went to camp, we went to the mall, we went to watch movies, we went swimming, we did a whole lot. And so I started pulling from some of those stories. And also when I moved here to Memphis, our church had, there was an adult, with some significant cognitive disabilities. And it was really awesome to see how she was able to be, a leader in our church, even, and how the church, just uplifted her dignity. And that really always left a mark on me. And so I started pulling from those stories as well. And so, so when I started working on PhD applications, I'd already taken the GRE and everything, and it just didn't sit right with me. And that's not exactly what I really wanted to do. So I I decided actually it might be more ethical for me to go and work in special education, as opposed to going and teaching about ethics. So so that's what I did. I applied with Memphis Teaching Fellows and got on teaching in the Fraser neighborhood, which is where the same neighborhood I still work in now. And yeah, so that's kind of how I got into special education. Uh, there's a quote about your where the world's great need and your kind of great passion kind of intersect, and that's kind of what your calling is. And so to me, I come out of that tradition of like religious calling kind of thing, and that's kind of where I saw myself being called to do.
I love that. I love that. And as somebody who has worked with you, and so I get to say this with confidence, right? Like you really are an advocate for those students in that building, and those families really came to love and respect and lean on you in ways that they may not have had somebody in other schools, that they were able to lean on. And so, yeah, I'm glad that you found your calling, and it's right where you should be. So, okay, so as we enter into testing season, I initially thought I wanted to do an episode on test prep, and I thought, okay, well, this could be helpful. But then after talking to you, right, it was like, well, it's not going to be very long. Like, there's not like a whole lot like you can do. It's very individualized and whatever. And so then as I started picking your brain, and you were gracious, and I was like, I just need 30 minutes with you. And we ended up like having a 2-hour conversation, which I wish I had recorded, because then we could avoid this, but so sorry I didn't hit record. So all that being said, it made me think about, after our conversation, like the good, the bad, the ugly of testing, which is now why I brought you on here. But I just think you have this added layer and perspective when it comes to testing, because you are working with students with disabilities and have accommodations that now need to be factored in. And so it makes testing probably even more nuanced for you than just the gen ed teacher or leader who's kind of walking around their building. So all that to say is, I'm going to start with just like a really simple, really straightforward question for you to respond to, just to kind of like set the tone. Mr. James Aycock, is testing good for kids?
Yeah. With most answers, if anyone gives you like a straightforward yes or no, that's probably an indication that either it's a simple issue and there are simple answers, or they're not being honest with you. So my answer would be it's complicated. It really depends. Testing gets a really bad reputation, and for a lot of good reasons, right? And in fact, a lot of schools and educators have really shifted their language, and because like the T word gets a bad name. So it's like kind of rebranding to a lot of times we call it like assessments now. um,
Better.
which is only because like the testing gets a bad name, right? But it is like you're trying to assess students and try to measure what they know and don't know, right? So, but I think like if you back up, you can ask yourself like, well, why do we test and like I said, like with assessments, like you go to the doctor, you get these assessments done, right? The purpose is really to figure out um, what knowledge and skills you have, right? That's what you're trying to measure. Like we taught you something, and did you learn it? Did you internalize it? Did you remember it? What do you know, and what can you do? That's like the big thing, and that's really essential because we use that information then to inform like what we do in classrooms every day. So that's really the big purpose is to give us information that we can then use to figure out what to do next. Of course, there are bad tests and there are bad ways to use tests, um, and there are good uses of testing that don't really mean much to kids. So it's a big conundrum there. But in most cases, we're testing students because we want to get information to help them learn better, help us teach them better. And like the bottom line is like tests are just tools in the toolbox.
So in its purest form, tests are good. Like, but
Yeah, I mean, you think right, like uh, when when your kid is learning to read, right? And like there's this like phonics sequence that you should teach, right? Uh, and you need to respond to what the student is actually doing, right? So if we're working on our vowels, right, and like the student hasn't mastered those vowels, well, you need to maybe slow down, try to do something different. Like, how can we adjust or do they just need more time, or do we need to adjust something to do something differently, right, before we move on? And then like once we move on, right, like that doesn't necessarily mean that we've 100% mastered something. So how can we like spiral that back in so that kind of that spaced retrieval practice, like they're still uh, there's I mean they've learned it, and now they have to like learn to recall it and to make it so it fits, right? And so
Right.
that, but if you think about it that way, it makes a lot of sense. And the same thing like if you're doing algebra, right? Like whatever we learned today, did like at the end of the day, I want to measure whether you mastered that or how much of it you mastered, right? And then that's going to affect like what we do next. But then like at the end of I don't know, a few lessons where we might have like a really brief little checkpoint quiz or something, right? To see like, okay, we've done like 3 or 4 lessons. Like, how much of that have you internalized, right? And then at the end of that unit, you want to do the same thing. But then, so then we keep going with our like quarter exams, right? And like they become cumulative. And so it's like not just this last but like actually we've learned 8 units now. So all 8 units are on there. And how much of that do you still remember? And that kind of fuels into like testing, right? Is like, okay, like we have 4 weeks until the state test, right? So how do we use that? This is actually something I was just doing last week, was taking all of the math standards and putting kids into like buckets about how well they are doing on those. And so like these kids just need some more practice maybe. These kids need a little push, and like this group of kids need like a whole reteach, right? And so that's going to inform like what we do in the next few weeks, right? As we're ramping up to get ready for the test.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, so you mentioned different types of tests, right? So there's different types of tools. We're doing different things with those tools, but so can you walk us through maybe a few of the different types of tests or assessments and the
Yeah.
purpose of each of those yeah, the
Yeah.
end.
Um, yeah, a lot of schools or teachers will do a pre-test at the beginning of the year, which is kind of informing like, well, how much of I'm working with sixth grade, right? So how much of sixth grade like do you already know, right? We don't need to teach you stuff you already know, so we can actually test the scope and sequence of our curriculum like based on what you already know. Um, so that's one reason to do that. The other reason is to get like just a baseline data point that then you can measure growth off of. So there are those tests that maybe you only take a few times a year, and you're really trying to get growth measures off of that. And then well, even with that, there's like here is sixth grade level content, and like we're measuring like how do you measure up against sixth grade level content. And if you don't know something, you could be at a fifth grade level, you could be at a first grade level. Like that test doesn't tell you that.
Yeah.
It just tells you like I'm not quite at sixth grade level, right? Um,
Yeah.
um, but there are some other tests, and one example is the MAP test, for Measures of Academic Progress, by NWEA, and it's a lot of schools and districts across the country take this. Even some private schools take this. It's sort of a national test, and it's really kind of cool because it's an adaptive test. Um, with a lot of, I mean, not a lot. There's a few tests that are becoming like this. They're using technology, and so this is a test you take on the computer, and it the test adapts to how you do it. I kind of compare it to when you go to the eye doctor, and the eye doctor flips things back and forth. And at
Yeah.
first, it's like wildly different, and you're like, "Oh, that's different." But as you go through your eye test, right, it kind of narrows the scope, and so where you had these big jumps, now you're having these really small jumps. By the end of the eye test, you're like, "I really don't know which one's different. I can't really tell." And that's where they know, like, okay, well, this is where you're at, right? because the difference is that small. And these tests do the same thing. And so it starts out giving you something, and if you get it correct, it actually gets a little bit harder. When you get a question incorrect, it gets a little bit easier, and it kind of bounces back and forth. And we always tell kids like they're like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know this stuff." Like that means you're doing good. Like it's
Yeah.
supposed to. If it's giving you stuff that you don't know, that means that you're actually growing a lot. So but it does it kind of bounces back and forth, and it gives you some more precise information. So um, and it'll give you, for example, in reading, uh, it'll give you an overall score, and then that score is kind of you kind of say about what grade level they're on. So maybe they're not on a fifth grade level, but they're on a fourth grade level. But even within that, it'll break it down into like three different strands. So to say like with literature, right, with fiction, here's where you are. With nonfiction, here's where you are. Informational text, and then with vocabulary, here's where you are. And it's really cool to see how kids are so different there. And like one kid maybe like really struggling with literature, and then they really have a hard time like getting into another person's perspective and under right, which is what you get with
Mhm.
fiction. But they may be really strong with vocabulary, or they may be like really strong with nonfiction. Um, or maybe vice versa. Maybe it's like I'm really, really good with empathy, and like so I can really embody this character, and my fiction, my literature scores are really high, but I really need to work on the vocabulary or something. So it gives you more precise information, and you can even break it down. It gives you reports on standard. So like one standard you might be on a ninth grade level, one standard you might be on a third grade level. So
And this is the MAP
I think those
adaptive
are really
test.
interesting. Yeah.
So I'm a parent.
So that's
I
like a really
think
interesting way that technology is kind of fueling
I
some
was about to
cool stuff.
say. Yeah. So okay, and is this are these because I'm this is a personal question. My daughter
Yeah.
takes MAP at her
Yeah.
school in first grade. I think they might do it twice. Maybe they do it 3 times a year. Um,
Yeah. It's
but
usually
I'm trying to
three, like fall, winter, spring.
okay. So should I be? Is this a report I should be asking for, Aycock? Like, is that something I
Yeah.
can? Is that standard? Like, if you are taking MAP, like schools have access to all of this information, or are there tiers maybe that like they have to pay, or
Yeah.
is it pretty standard?
No, I think that's pretty standard.
Okay.
Now whether parents don't usually get all of that, but
Yeah.
because that like kind of detail, but that is something that you can ask for. And if you know, I know how to use this. I can do right. You can do
Yeah.
that. You can also just like talk to your teacher and have them like, all right, what are I like to think both in terms of strengths and in areas,
Mm-hmm.
of growth. Um, because like if you keep just giving your kids the stuff that they're not doing great at, that's
It's
not gonna,
discouraging. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, and it's not gonna fuel their joy or their passions. And so we
Yeah.
do want to know like what is it that they're crushing, um, and because like those are the things that they're probably interested in,
Yeah.
have a lot of joy from, and you want to encourage that. And so that really helps you like know like how can I like what kind of special, maybe like a summer program that I want to find can be aligned with this or something. But you do want to know like what areas they need some help in, and there are things that you could do as a parent. There's also just talking to your teachers like how can we put a plan in place for this, and there could be something they do in the classroom. There could be something the teacher helps to send home. So I think working together with the teacher is always a good idea there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I might have gotten you off track because I just went down a
Yeah.
little map rabbit hole. Okay, so we were talking. So yeah, so there's these adaptive type assessments. There's like that diagnostic type of assessment, which is just kind of giving you a baseline. And then I think you might
Yeah.
have were about to mention some, at least one other, if not more.
Yeah, yeah, and it kind of goes back to what I was mentioning before. It's like um, those assessments that measure the skills on a daily basis, um, um, and then like I said, like over those like short term and long term uh, measures, and so that's where we build in. We usually call them like an exit ticket or
Yeah,
something like that on the daily basis.
yeah,
Um, they're actually in math this year we're calling it target task. This is the target task, but um, and
cute.
and like the quiz that you have, that like short term quiz, like I don't know, we're in math we're calling it those are checkpoints, right?
Yeah.
and then like you're building up to that unit test, which we just call it like the show what you know. And so
Take a little pressure
those
off
are
of
yeah, yeah. And
those
then
ones.
you have like your quarter exams, right? And like I said, all of this is just kind of a spiral because the goal is not just to learn something now. And that's like you really want you're measuring, did you learn it now? Because if you didn't learn it now, we need to like immediately like what can we do to intervene? But then, like I said, you really want to keep testing things because the goal is just long term mastery. Like you know it, you can do it, and you don't really have to even think about it, right? Like that's the goal.
Yeah.
Uh, and so we need to measure that space that spaced out like that, which actually is a like part of the way that we teach kids stuff is actually give them opportunities for retrieval like that. And the more
Mm.
that they actually have to retrieve it, and it's like your brain's like trying to find where it is, right? And the more that you do that, the more automatic, and your brain learns this is important, right? And so it kind of puts it in a in a more accessible place, right? The things that we don't, I mean,
Yeah.
like so I'm in, like you mentioned, I'm one of the scout leaders. One of the things that all the scouts have to learn are these knots. But even if you know your knots, if you don't use them,
Yeah.
you like forget how to do it. Like you lose it really quickly. And so you really have to be able to keep doing things. And that's what, so like we went camping this weekend and like, oh, like actually we're having to tie, this taut line, right? Uh, and you're having to remember like, oh, how do you tie a taut line? And then as you do it, you're like, oh yeah. And you got to tie, four of them. And by the fourth one, you just do it with your eyes closed.
So
And as you
interesting.
like just practice recalling that, but like by the next camping trip, if you don't go for one in a couple months, before we try to go pretty quickly, but we go like once a month. But if you don't go for a couple months, you're going to lose that.
Yeah.
And so the same thing in school, right? If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. So it's really important uh, to give students opportunities for retrieving this information or these skills.
On a more regular basis. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. That makes sense. Yeah. It's applicable. Any other assessments or types of assessments?
Yeah. So I mean, we mostly what we've been talking about so far is like classroom kind of measures, right?
Yeah.
Um, the the one that gets the big bad reputation are the state tests, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so there is like this like standardized state test, and I mean, and there again, it's not a yes or no kind of situation. It's all muddy because there's there's a good reason for us to have standardized tests, right? You've got um, funding comes from like local government, but a lot of our funding comes from state government. And the state like has an interest in making sure that schools are doing well. And then the same thing, we get funding for federal government. They have an interest in knowing that schools are doing well, right? And, you can have, at the school level, you can have two teachers teaching the same subject in the same grade level, but they teach it differently.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, like, they're just making up their own test, then like your data might be really good, but maybe your test wasn't very good. Right. Um, and so that's where, the state wants to step in and say, like, we want to standardize the test. We want everyone to take the same test. And so it becomes, in theory, it becomes a fair playing field where everyone's taking the same test. There are ways that it might not be fair with that, um, but that's kind of the idea, right? You want everyone to be the same, and also then you're getting it scored by people who don't even know you, and that's at my first school, we were really big about like competition, and we're like, yeah, this is they don't know you. You're just a number to them. Let's show them what we can do, kind of thing. But different schools. That's not the way that I've done it in any school since. But that was the culture of that school. Um,
Yeah.
but it kind of showed like, oh, like these are these like faceless people that don't even know you, and on the one hand, like you can like really show what you know, but on the other hand, also it's like, well, they don't even know you, so like they can't be anyone who's like mad at you and going to score you like harder than somebody else, right? There's no favoritism
Yeah.
there. It's just
Right.
blind. And so that's kind of the idea, with the state test, and then like everyone can just be compared to like how they did on the same exact test.
Yeah.
Um, I would say the problem with that, I mean, that seems to be, I don't know, the big problem with that is just background knowledge, especially when it comes to like reading. What we know about reading, and this has been proved like over and over again, um, is that it's it it once you learn how to read, like the state tests aren't testing phonics, right? They're testing comprehension.
Right.
And so like
Okay,
once you
right.
actually learn how to read the word, your comprehension, your understanding is largely based on your background knowledge. And that's where there's been like study after study, and I know my one of my big favorite authors is Daniel Willingham, who's a cognitive psychologist at University of Virginia, who I think like takes all this complicated uh, science, brain science, and make it acceptable to teachers and parents. And he talks about these studies. There's the baseball study, the soccer study, but it takes this group of students and based on what we already know of them, it's like here are students who are strong readers, here are students that are not as strong, and we would expect the strong readers to score high, the low readers to score low. But they give them this story about a situation in baseball,
Okay.
and what happens is the students who know a lot about baseball and are good readers score really high, like we expect them to.
Yeah.
And the students who are low readers who don't know much about baseball score really low, as we expect them to. But it's those other two groups of students that kind of surprise us. You have the high readers, readers that are really strong, who don't have background knowledge about baseball, and they score pretty low. And then you have these
Hmm.
low readers who have a lot of background knowledge about baseball, who score really high. So these low
Huh.
readers are scoring higher than the high readers because of the background knowledge. Because these high readers, when they're trying, like they can't figure out what's happening because they don't know, when it says like, uh, Missy gets the ball at third. Well, like, what does that even mean? What does third mean? Like,
Right.
yeah,
Like, yeah, I don't
and
even.
throws it across to Johnny, and they're like, well, I don't understand. Trying to figure out what the base runners are doing, and all. So it becomes
Yeah.
really, really complicated to actually figure out unless you have that background knowledge.
Yeah.
So the reading tests are really kind of a knowledge test. And that's where it creates an unfair playing field, actually, because we know that some students have more background knowledge because of the opportunities that they've been exposed to, um, and so you can see where that test might actually not be measuring reading. it
Yeah. Yeah. But
um,
yeah, this is okay. So this is interesting because then you also think about like a standardized test, like right, the state assessment being an equalizer in the sense that going back to your original point, right, is there's can be no bias, right? As far as like when
right,
it comes to grading, right? And so
right,
the kid who comes from an under resourced community or school or whatever, but is taking the same test as the kid who's coming from the very fluent school, like at the end of the day, they both scored, in the 8th percentile. And so when it comes to options for potentially college, like so in that way, it feels like an equalizer. But it's
yep,
interesting to your point, right? It's like, but how do we get these kids who might potentially, I think about all the time, like from Memphis, right? Like so many of our kids hadn't ever seen the river, right? Like,
right,
and you're like, the
right,
river is literally 10 minutes from you, but you've never gotten a chance to go see it, right? For whatever
yep.
reason. So yeah, to give them these access points. So I guess in light of that, and I mean, I don't know, this is again a very big existential questions. Like, what do you do? Like, what do we
Yeah,
do? How do you overcome that and make it to where tests are able to be like, I mean, even just my husband and I, who come from very similar backgrounds, if I were to take a test about baseball versus him who grew up watching, like, I'm like, how do I, like, even, I was like, I mean, my parents
yeah,
watch baseball, but not, I still don't know it in the same way he does. So, like, even,
right,
how do you
right.
do
And
it?
that's where like actually your English test now like may have a text that's that's some kind of scientific concept, right? And you're not learning science in English class. Uh, it also may be some text that is set in the Great Plains, and you're not learning history in that class. It may be set in ancient
Right.
Rome, right? So like depending on what text you get is going to be largely determinative of like how you do as long as you determine like what do you know. Um,
Yeah.
and that's where like a knowledge rich curriculum is like really important and really important from an early age. And so what the lingo that people like to use is like, oh, from like uh, up to second grade, you're learning how to read, and then in grade three, you're reading to learn, which is a big like people like to say that, and it really bothers me because like actually you can learn things like what one you continue to learn how to read
Yep.
because the texts get like more complex. So
Yep.
the more complex you have to learn new skills. So you're still learning how to read. Uh, Also, what reading means can be like oral, right? Like so part of you learning comprehension skills has to start way before you know how to read because it comes with listening comprehension skills. And that's where you really need to be pumping in, history and science and things like that at an early age. There's a guy named E.D. Hirsch who's like the uh, is seen as one of the big influences in this. Then they built CKLA, Core Knowledge Language Arts, which is all about like what are the like core standard things that every child has to know, and building that knowledge foundation. And like I said, a lot of that you actually start doing before the kids know how to read. Um, but also a lot of it you can give kids things that are above them by again like doing some oral stuff even for older kids,
Hmm.
right? So just practicing those comprehension skills and giving them that knowledge base. So that's really, really important. Um, oh, also, so in one of Daniel Willingham's books that I was talking about earlier, he looks at they do this survey of teachers in elementary schools, and they look at like how much of your day is spent on what activities. And from like K through two, I wish I had it in front of me, but it's at work. But I want to say something like 75% of the day is spent on reading. And then
Hmm.
there's like a small bit on math. There's, some stuff on art and, recess and stuff, right? But like the vast majority of the day is spent on reading. And once you get to third grade, uh, some of that reading goes down a little bit just to incorporate more math because now you have that math state test. um, and but like you're not getting very much history or science. And I don't know if you remember this that when we were working at Grizzlies, like kids would come and they would be so enthralled by their science and history classes, right?
Loved it. Loved it. I mean, good
and
teachers
it
in those
and
subjects too, but yeah, they did
yeah,
love
yeah,
it.
no, the teachers are really good.
Yeah.
But I would talk to kids about this because it
Yeah.
really like it fascinated me,
Yeah.
and I was like, how are these kids who are really struggling in English doing so well in history?
Right.
Um, and I would talk to kids, and they never had a history class. A lot of them, or maybe
So
they
it's
had
just
it twice a
new.
week or something, right? And then all of a sudden in sixth grade, you have history class every single day of the week, and they love it. Like kids are
Yeah.
naturally curious, and they want to know about the world, and so that's both like science, and they want to know about the world and like how it came to be, which is like history, right? Like these are things that kids are naturally curious about, and we deprive them that from an early age. I mean, we don't, but a lot of schools, this is like the trend, right?
Yeah.
And so you get these kids once they learn how to read, they don't have the background knowledge in order to understand what they're reading. And so that's why it's so key to give them that. It's not like you step one, step two, but they're parallel that have to be moving together. Both the comprehension, the vocabulary, and the actual like phonics pieces, like to learning to read the words. So all of that just like spirals together.
Yeah. I think my next question to you is going to be like, how do like teachers or schools or district states, right, differentiate a good test from a bad test? Because of course, every state has its own, but it almost sounds like it's kind of a mute point. Like, I don't know. I mean, it feels like a pointless question. And what I'm actually hearing is like schools and teachers should, rather than focusing so much about like what the test is, which of course you need to know the structure of a test, right? Like you need to know, like, especially as you get into
Yeah.
like the ACT or SAT, right? Like, are you penalized for missing? Like, are you penalized for not
Yeah.
answering? Like,
Yeah.
so that goes back
Right.
to the test strategy. So you do need to understand the test, its purpose and all of those things. But it sounds like what you're saying is like, rather than schools focusing on that, it's focusing more on just making sure your curriculum is really rich in content and exposure, and making sure that they're having access to a wide range of, whether that's fiction and nonfiction and, just like weaving in all of that kind of cross curricular. But
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe you have some suggestions too, like differentiating a good versus bad test. And again, schools can only control so much, and teachers can only control so much within the confines of their walls. I don't know. It's just like a part of me is like, where does one spend their energy? And it's like,
Yeah.
what,
Yeah.
when you think about kids, it's like, what do we need to be doing for them to make sure that they're getting the most out of it?
So since when I was growing up, we didn't have this heavy testing culture. And like we took tests, like I remember like there was the ITBS, the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, that we had to take. I don't even know how often we took it. I just remember we took it. And there was like one other one, I want to maybe California or something. I don't remember, but we had to take these tests in elementary school. Like I said, I don't know, maybe once or twice, but like that wasn't a big deal.
Yeah.
Whereas like the state tests now are like a really big deal, and there's a lot of pressure around that, and a lot of uh, and and it has tended in a lot of places to shape how schools teach and what they teach. Um, and so when I was growing up, like you just taught for the kids to get the skills and knowledge they needed, and then if they did, like they were going to be fine on whatever test you gave them.
Yeah.
Right. And there are some, like you said, there's some strategies that you have to learn. But those strategies, there's research around that. Like it short doses of that, and like there's diminishing returns. And so like you only need to give a little bit of that. Teach kids how to, um, eliminate answer choices, right? And
Right.
like that process of elimination, once you learn that, you know it. You don't need to keep teaching the kids that. Like you teach it to
Yeah.
them like once or twice, and like they've got it.
Yeah.
And like kids are just practicing doing that all the time now, right? And so that, and like you said, depending on what test it is, it's like, okay, do I want to leave things blank because I'm going to be penalized for it, or do you want to like, all right, you've got just a couple minutes left, you need to finish everything you can. It doesn't even matter if you, yeah, right. And so they're like, those are strategies that again, just very short doses, you can do that.
Yeah.
But what has happened though is like our whole curriculum has been changed by this test. And so my daughter in middle school was at one of the like flagship middle schools in the district. And then like within that school, there's like a school within a school, right, where you have to test into it. And you've got to be at like the 75th percentile in both math and reading. So these are like the top, 25% of kids in the city or in the state. Uh, and their English class never read a book. Um, they're reading short passages because that's what the test is. The test is short passages. And so
So they just
all
did.
that's all they did. They never actually read a novel. And like there was just a big piece in the Atlantic about this, about like these Ivy League students who can't read books. And their professor is like, you're the, you know, quote unquote, the brightest kids in the country. Right.
Right.
And you can't read a book. You can't, right. It's because like the schools have, and even, like I said, even the top, most high achieving, whatever, are not reading books anymore. And I think that is really depriving kids of that joy in reading that takes to be motivated to read. It also deprives them of that like empathy, like actually reading this novel, you have to follow this character and get inside of them, and which helps you socially. There's a lot of different outcomes of that, but like I said, because the test and they're changing their curriculum to match what the test is, but that's not necessarily the way to get the results from the test. Because
Yeah.
all you're doing is like you're not actually getting kids invested in reading, right? Which like a good novel will do. And like we just finished on Friday. We were reading kind of a young reader's version of the Odyssey, and they loved it. They loved it, and
So
it was
great.
matching up. with what they were they just were studying ancient Greece and Rome in history class, and now like they're like, oh yeah, I know all about Odysseus, I know about Achilles, like I know about these people, right? And they're
Yeah.
bringing their background knowledge that they just learned in history into reading the Odyssey, and they were just eating it up. But that's not the opportunity that most kids get.
Yeah.
And so when this is kind of related to this idea that about like teaching to the test, right?
Yeah.
Um, so the way that like good teachers plan their lessons, right? Is like you actually start with the test at the end. Like you start with this is what I want you to know, and then it's your job then to like backwards plan. How am I going to get there? Right? Like how am I
Right.
going to get kids ready for this test? And I know what's on the test. Um, Now the state test, we never see it, and so like you can't actually plan for that. So you don't know what passages are on there. You know what skills are going to be on there, but again, like with reading, applying that skill to a text that you don't have the background knowledge is going to be really difficult.
Right.
So you can actually know that skill, but not know um, that background knowledge is going to really hurt you. But that's what a lot of schools have done is they're like drastically altering their curriculum to teach to the test. Um, and like that's not necessarily it's a good thing to teach the test in your classroom about the test that you're going to actually give them at the end of
Right.
this unit.
Right.
It's not necessarily a good idea to teach to the test uh, for the state test like that, um, because then you're just
Interesting.
altering your curriculum and you're abandoning like sound pedagogical practices.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah.
I do not envy teachers. Like that's, I mean, I wasn't a good teacher, but that is, feels just like you're constantly like against a wall where it's like, yeah, I want to be able to do exposure stuff, but I may or may not have some administration that's saying, well, no, but these are the things that, you need to hone in on this and you're missing a huge gap.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, good teaching is good teaching, and we need
Yeah.
to like rely on that. Like, you know your craft, you know the research, you know what is good teaching, and that's what we need to be doing. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
and
Well, I
that's
have a
going to get
question.
results. That's the thing.
Right. Right. Okay, well, this is sort of an outlier question, but I think it gets back to a little bit of just maybe some practical steps for a parent, right? So I have a friend whose daughter is in a private school, right? So they don't have the pressure of the standardized test, right? So in theory, right,
Yeah.
it's like great, like you're not driving towards this, so you have a lot of freedom with your curriculum and how you teach and all of things, right? They decided they needed to pull their child out of their private school and go to a different school for issues unrelated to academics, right? Like they didn't even know that was like a red flag. It was unrelated. Went to go try to test to get into this other private school, and this other private school was like, well, your child is a full year plus behind. So if they were to get in, they would need to repeat, which, this kid's in fourth grade, like that is heavy compared to like, okay, I've got a kindergarten who needs to repeat kindergarten, right? Or, those younger grades. And my friend is just like, what? Like I had no idea my kid's coming home with
Yeah.
A's on their math homework, and they're coming home with good grades on their assessments and, spelling tests and all of the things. And so I was a little bit struck by that because I was going, oh my goodness, like how does a parent know whether or not their kid is being set up for success and getting all of the skills they need along the way? If like, I mean, I guess my question to you is like, if my kid is not subject to a state standardized test now, but of course will ultimately, assuming they want to, do college next, right? How do I know whether or not they are on grade level? What advice would you have for this parent to make sure that they don't fall into that same situation again at their next school and then for the next,
Yeah.
7 years?
Yeah. Well, and also like as you know, because I know a lot of your work had to do with helping eighth graders get into like the best high schools they can get into, and a lot of those have test entrance exams and stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You got the same thing at different levels, right? I was just a couple of years ago before we opened our middle school, was doing that same kind of work for middle school students, trying to get fifth graders into sixth grade. And so there are, even though you might not be taking a test every year, there's like this endpoint, whether it's kindergarten readiness for preschool, whether it's middle school testing in, whether it's high school you're testing in, or whether it's college and you're testing in, there are these
It's
endpoints
true.
that you have to be ready for. Um, and yeah, it is a big quandary there. And for what it's worth, this is actually the position that most parents were in before the current testing regime started. So I started when I started teaching. I came in with the first year of a new test. The year before, there was, and this kind of gets into like how do they set the benchmarks for what's passing, what's considered grade level, whatever. And our school had like 90% on grade level proficient at this old test. And so all of those families were being told your kids are doing okay, kind of
Yeah.
like your friend.
Yeah.
And then the state started a new test the next year, and all of a sudden we went from like 90% to 5% proficient. Like that's where that's more in line with reality of what teachers were seeing on an everyday basis. Like these kids are really struggling, they're really far behind. But the state was saying like, oh, this is okay, and overnight it became like not okay. But that's kind of the situation that I think your friend was facing, right? And I would say like that's where you have to talk to your teachers. Um,
Yeah.
the and even no matter what, because you don't want to wait till like the end of the year or whatever. Like um, you should be talking to your teachers just ongoing,
Yeah.
just to make sure like how are we doing, right? And so I would say at the very least you should have at least two or three like parent teacher meetings throughout the year, or that could be a phone call. It could be like I would say at least once or twice you should come in the building, sit down, and like talk about things. But even like over the course of the year, I try to reach out to or I track parent contacts and things, and I try to make sure that every parent gets a contact, if not from me, from somebody, at least once a month. But a lot of kids who maybe like are struggling, they're getting like five contacts a week,
Yeah.
and it from different teachers. But it's like, hey, like I'm really proud of what what this kid did today. And that kind of, but also then when you say like, hey, like we're really struggling with this, what can we do? Like maybe let's stay after school for tutoring or something, right? And I'm going to send this thing home. Can y'all go over it together? So that kind of relationship needs to be like constantly happening,
Yeah.
pretty frequently, and then you're not going to be surprised.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Just here. I know you're right. Kid, like the teachers do know them because again, in theory, right? Like they're doing all of those daily check-ins and they're seeing their
Right,
work coming in, even though
right,
all of that work doesn't necessarily come home on a regular
right.
basis. And so
Well,
love
and
that.
grades. So like you may be looking at, so maybe that parent was looking at grades and like their grades are fine, so I don't have to
Yeah.
worry. But I think that's where it's important also to know like what is your school or what are your teachers like grading, policies, because um, a lot of times, like most schools, it's not just here's how you're doing. Like it's not your assessment scores.
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's your assessment scores, but then you also have kids who have all these zeros because they're not turning in work. You've got right, and so like there are some grades that you just grade for like completion, right, and which is kind of these work habits. And for what it's worth, there's some research that suggests that maybe that is more predictive of how you will do in college and life, right? As opposed to this like genius that we know a couple of who really struggle with these daily living skills, who like I can't get anything done, I can't turn anything in. And so I'm, even though I have like the potential to do all this amazing work, and if you talk to me, I can give you all of that,
Yeah.
I just can't actually do the work. And those kids are really going to struggle in life and in college.
Yeah.
um, and but like it's important to know like where your student is, where your child is. Are they someone who is really strong, with the concepts and skills and understanding? Are they someone who are really strong with work habits and getting things done, and are just like maxing out everything that they can give you. um, and like, where do you, those are like two different axes, and like kind of knowing where your kid falls on both of them is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good
Because the kid
advice.
may have the same grade, like two kids may have the same grade but get it for different reasons.
Right, right. Yeah. One worked really hard and did all the
Yeah,
extra.
right.
Like,
But then they go and take that test though,
test.
and that kid who just worked really hard
Yeah.
to do everything they could to max out their potential, like they might
Yeah.
not do as well on that test. Whereas
Right.
that other kid who really is like failing, getting their work done,
Yeah.
they can go take a test and ace it with their eyes closed. And like, we know some kids like that.
We do. We
um,
do.
and uh, so kind of
Yeah.
depending on what you want, what opportunities you want for your kids, like you need to know where they are so you can support them to get there.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. How are we already at time? I mean, not, we're not at time. We have unlimited time. I act like I have this constraint that somebody's telling me like, hey, you need to keep your episodes to this length. Nobody is. I get to decide. But you mentioned like supports. And so I just, again, because you are sitting in front of me and this is your love, I do want to touch a little bit on, accommodations, the purpose of them, but then really, again, going back to like that parent piece of just like, how do parents know whether to, advocate for that? Whether it's, is this a will or a skill issue? Like, is this something that, we need to intervene, or is this just, no, we need to reinforce maybe some particular habits? So
Yeah.
talk maybe a little bit about accommodations, their role in assessments, but then maybe a little bit of a piece of, for parents and some advice around that.
Yeah. At the classroom level, we have a lot more flexibility. You can be like, oh, I know this kid uh, really processes things slowly, and like I can give them some extra time.
Yeah.
But when it comes to state tests, you can't do that. On the state tests, the only kids who can get those kind of accommodations are students with disabilities who have like a documented plan, whether that's a 504 plan or an IEP, which is special education plan. So you need one of those two in order to get those official state accommodations. Those also will follow you to the ACT, and so you can get accommodations with the ACT. They look for you to have a history of having accommodations. So if you wait to like, oh gosh, I'm in 10th grade, my kid needs these accommodations, the ACT may not approve them. For the state test in like Tennessee, what's on your plan is what happens. But the ACT, you actually have to submit it to the ACT body, and they have to approve it. And I've seen them be denied,
Oh,
and a lot of times
gosh.
specifically for this reason. Like, there's no history of actually like you needed this for years, and so that is actually a reason to, like, if you suspect something, don't wait. Go ahead and talk to your teacher, talk to your school, talk to your doctor, depending on what it is, right? Maybe like ADHD or something. Like, you could be talking to your doctor, maybe do some assessments there to figure out what's going on. And some of these can even like follow you to college. My wife, when she was in college, actually was asked to be a scribe for a student. I don't know. I'm just gonna assume maybe the student had dyslexia, and so they would give my wife a little carbon copy notepad, and she would take notes, and then like give the carbon copy to this person to review. This person could pay attention and listen and understand everything, but like writing for someone who has dyslexia is extremely hard.
Yeah.
Trying to get those words out, especially as fast as a college class might be going, and so that was the accommodation there. So even some of this stuff could follow you to college, but so accommodations, the main ones that we see are, so extended time would be one, and there's different reasons that you might have extended time. Um, Maybe you need extended time because you have ADHD and you get off task and distracted, and so and so maybe it really takes you some time to get back on task and all. So that might be one reason for that. Another one may be like processing, and so there's some students with language impairments who really just struggling to process. That happens a lot with autism as well. They process things slowly. they can understand it. It just might take them a little bit longer, and so we give them that extra time. There's also uh, with read aloud or oral testing, and so these students, again, like a student with dyslexia, for example, who maybe has the phonic skills to read the words, but trying to put those all together, it takes so much brain power um, that they're
Yeah.
really just working on deciphering the words, the letters and the words, and they can't really put their brain towards understanding. And so we can read it out loud. It kind of offloads that from your brain, and they can just focus on understanding. Um,
Yeah.
I, I like to compare this to well, let's say you have kids like uh, y'all have been learning to tie shoes, right? Um,
We've been learning
when
what?
to tie
Oh,
shoes.
tying shoes. Yes, yes, tying shoes. Yep, yep,
So
yep.
when you're first learning to tie shoes, you cannot talk to your kid. Like if you talk to them, they get distracted, they mess up, right? But once you master it, you can have like the TV going and mom's talking to you and like I'm kind of dancing and tying my shoe at the same time because it's automatic. And like that's
Yeah.
the goal. The goal is to get it to be like automatic. But for kids with dyslexia, like reading is never going to be automatic. You get a lot better at it. You can read, you can learn to read well. But it's always going to, that fluency piece is always going to be really hard. So if you read it out
Yeah.
loud, they can just offload that part of the brain and just focus on reading. So those are really the two main accommodations that we see. But again, like that, someone who has dyslexia, they may have a scribe. So like when they write their essays, they might actually speak out loud and have the
Somebody else
adult write it
right.
down for them. So that's another option.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah,
really, I think that's great that that's available to people. And I think
yeah,
it's important for families and parents to know that that is an option, and just going back even to the point of like just talking to your teacher about where your kid is, like having those open lines of communication are going to be your best bet to ensure that your kid is staying on track, is being pushed where they need to be pushed, is being supported where they need to be supported. And again, even just having those frank conversations about like, hey, these are some things that we're seeing. Let's keep an eye on it and see if we need to maybe up our potential for intervention. So,
yeah. And those plans actually have to be revised every year. Uh,
okay, yeah, that's
because
right.
just because you need
Yep.
something right now doesn't mean that you will always need that, right? So you grow and change, and there's a there are several kids that I've had that it's like they really need read aloud, and then they get to a point where they're actually reading fluently and don't actually need the read aloud anymore. Some kids will always need it, and like
Yeah.
you shouldn't feel bad if your kid always needs it.
Right.
But we could always be reevaluating like where are we at, what do we need based on the information that we have. And so yeah, and also like maybe you need double time right now for extended time, but maybe you can cut it back to time and a half or something, right? So there
Yeah, it's really
you can
scaled.
have
Yeah.
different links there.
Oh, that's cool. I love that. I love that. Um. All right, Aycock. Is there anything else in this, like where you're like, like, how did I not mention that thing while I had an audience? Is there anything?
um, yeah, that's one thing I kind of hinted at it. Like when I mentioned that, like one year our school was at like 90%. That was the year before I got there, and then it dropped to 5%.
Yeah.
And then we were able to grow from there. And like 2 years later, we were up to like 17%, right? So but I think so. It's really important to kind of understand when you take a test in your classroom, you have like your standard grading scale, right?
Yeah.
And so like whether some schools it's like 70 is passing, some maybe 60 if you like have D's, right? But like that's what it takes to pass.
Yeah.
Um, that's not necessarily the way that the state test works. And in fact, the most recent test, they've set the bar for quote unquote passing what they call meeting expectations. They've set it aligned with um, the ACT college readiness standards. And so they actually did a linking study with kids who took the MAP test that we talked about earlier, and
Mm-hmm.
kids who took the state test. And what they found, it's different for like different grade levels and different test subjects, but somewhere around like 65th percentile is where the cut is. And that's like a national percentile. That would say that like 35% of kids in the nation would pass this test, which means like 65% are not.
Not.
And we've
Yeah.
seen this used. I just mentioned that because we hear in the news a lot about these kids can't read, these kids can't read, these kids can't read. And that is not what's happening. there,
Yeah.
there are a lot of kids who are struggling, right? Like we at Grizzlies, with like 10% of our kids would come in to sixth grade who haven't mastered phonics yet, which is
Yeah.
like they're on like a kindergarten first grade level. Um, and only maybe 10% were reading on grade level. So like, but it's not to say that everything is great.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but to put the bar of like the only kids that we're going to say are meeting expectations are those who are on track to be college ready. That's missing a whole gap, right? Because like only about a third of people in the nation go to college, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's right. It makes sense. Like, okay, this is about a third of kids that we're saying meet expectations. But there's a whole lot of kids who graduate high school who like met the expectation for that and can go and have a job and go into
Right.
whether it's like a trade school, like right. These kids also um, aren't. It's not like they can't read, like
That's
right.
so true.
So
Yeah.
so like the
Yeah.
50th percentile, right? 50th percentile is average. The average range is from like the 40th to the 60th, like so like that's like your range, like around that 50th percentile. And you're saying that kid who is average does not meet the expectation. Um, and so I think that's something else to consider when it comes to state test is like looking at where the cut is.
Hmm.
And that's where maybe the state test maybe is saying like you don't meet expectations, but you talk to your teacher and they're like, actually they're doing just fine. They're reading on grade level. They're just
Yeah.
asking because that kid who is like, quote unquote, like, ready for college on path to like they're actually above grade level,
Right.
right? Like at the 65th percentile, 70th percentile, those kids are above grade level.
Yeah.
And so it's important to keep that in mind, like where are the cut scores and what does it mean and how does that compare to what we've seen in the classroom? So yeah.
A lot of data. A
Yeah.
lot of data to take in. Oh my goodness. And
Well,
just
that's where I
like
live is in
you
data world.
you do live in data world. It's a different world, James. It's a
Yeah.
different world. Um awesome. This was really great. This is really helpful. It does make me it does empower me as a parent. Like it's
Yeah.
weird to be on this side of things, right? Like so much of my career in schools was pre having kids, and so now I'm on the flip side of that, and I have kids who are getting into actual like phonics and all of those things, and just you all of a sudden start to ask very different questions and really assess whether or not like the school you're sending them to is is helping them, or is it like just it's different. It's really fun. So um okay.
Yeah, I would say just like the
I
big takeaway is like just the more that you know, the more that you are empowered. And
Yeah.
then like let's take that and just increase the communication that you have.
Yeah.
Like it comes down to like I want to know as much as I can about my kids, and the only way to make that happen is to get the communication going, and then we can work together as partners. That's
Yeah.
the big takeaway.
Yeah. Yeah. I used to, yeah. Cause I think I used to think like, oh, no news is good news. But actually
No.
it's not. I need to actually hear some news. I
Right.
need some
Well, you're not
information.
going to maximize their potential without hearing. And that, like, because our
Yeah.
kids have always been, higher performing, like, we have often not heard from teachers. But it's like, how do you push your kids to become even better, or to,
Right.
if you don't get that information. So, yeah,
Yeah.
if you're not hearing from your teachers, reach out to them. They
Yeah.
would love to talk to you. They're probably just overwhelmed by all the other. They would love to talk to you. I promise you, they
Yeah.
would love to talk to you.
Yeah. Okay, you heard it here first, everybody.
Yes.
Your teachers would love to talk to you. Awesome. Okay, well, I have one final question. It's the question I ask all of my guests in the spirit of my company's name. And I know you're on spring break, so this could be hopefully more of a personal than a professional box you're checking off. But what is one box, big or small, personal or professional, that you hope to check off today?
Yeah. Yeah, at spring break, I get to catch up on my unpaid jobs as board chair. So I just did an interview yesterday a candidate for a new director for our day school. So I'm really hoping to
Fun.
get the board together this week to do that. And that's probably not going to happen today, but that's hoping to happen this week. Is to make a decision there. And then the other is, I'm in the scout troop. I'm the advancement coordinator. So I always on spring break, I always like send out reports to families. Again, communications, same thing, and let them know like here's how your scout is doing. Here's what they need to take care of. So that is what I'll be doing this afternoon, and checking those boxes off.
I love that. I love that so much. Awesome. Okay. Well, folks, I'm going to also little fact. James has written a piece, and gosh, this was several years ago, but it's resurfaced because it's very relevant. But so I'm going to put that in the episode notes. It's all around testing and essentially, yeah, whether testing is good or bad for kids, and you'll get to hear his fleshed out thoughts around that. And then he's a super avid reader, so I know he's recommended some books to me in the past. So I'm going to link those there because I think it's important because whatever James is reading is good stuff. So, and you mentioned you have a book subscription little service, and I think
Oh yeah.
Tell us what that's called again, James.
It's called the Next Big Idea Club.
The Next Big Idea Club.
Yeah, the Next Big Idea Club. It's Adam Grant and Malcolm Gladwell and Daniel Pink and Susan Cain, who are four like big thought leaders. And they every quarter they send out a little box that has two of the latest nonfiction. It's all nonfiction, but like this month they sent out Meditations for Mortals by Oliver Berkman, and they sent out Hope for Cynics by Jamil Zakai. So those are the two latest ones that they sent out. But even they have a classroom component, like you can learn the book in 15 minutes. The big ideas of the book. There's the books that they send you like a whole list of like 50 books coming up, and then they narrow it down to two. But so you know who all those are, you can see which ones you like, and they often do kind of like book talks on the ones that they don't even choose, so you can do that. But anyway, I've been doing that. God, I've been doing that for probably about 7 or 8 years.
Oh, I love that. We have Meditation for Mortals. I've been picking my way through it. It's really good. So if you haven't started it, it's very relevant and digestible, and it's great. So okay, well I'm gonna link that in there too because I think that's
it's really good for people who are like in leadership positions. There's always stuff that is really helpful for leaders.
Okay, good to know. Good to know.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Not just
all right. Well, James,
right?
What'd you say? Not just education,
but like just any like business world, like whatever.
Which I think is so great because education, we sometimes find ourselves and just keep going to the same like ed focused. And there's just this whole world of businesses and marketing and things that we could really draw from to like reinforce a lot of the things we're doing and really improve in some areas. So I think that's great. Okay, James, this was a pleasure. Love chatting with you. It's always fun, always informative, always leaves me just feeling a little bit smarter because I sat in your company and I appreciate it. So listeners, check out the episode notes to some of the resources and things that he's, what he's reading and what he's written. And everybody just, gear up for that testing season, but more than anything, chat with your kids' teachers. And if you're a teacher listening to this or a leader, encourage your staff to get out there and communicate to all of those parents and make sure y'all are a partner. So lovely. We'll see y'all next time. Thank you all for listening to today's Pro Series conversation. Our team is always looking for more pros to learn from in the field of education. So if you have a recommendation for a future guest, or maybe you are the pro, then send us a note at info@checkboxpro.com. And if you want to hear from more pros, then like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. And by doing so, this also helps more folks find our show. So take a moment to check that box off your list today.